The hedgerow explodes. A Panzer IV lurches sideways, its turret spinning free of the hull in a geyser of flame and steel. The second tank in column slams its brakes. The commander throws open his hatch, screaming into the radio for contact reports. Nothing. The third Panzer reverses blindly into a ditch. Somewhere in the green tangle of Norman bocage, less than 40 yards away, an American Sherman sits motionless, its engine cold, its crew barely breathing. The German commander scans the hedgerows through his binoculars. Trees, mud, shadows. He sees nothing that looks like a tank. He dies 30 seconds later, still searching. The summer of 1944 arrived in Normandy with the weight of history pressing down on every acre of contested ground. The invasion beaches had been secured at terrible cost. Now the war moved inland, into terrain that seemed designed by malevolent gods to consume armies whole. The bocage country of northwestern France had been farmed for 1,000 years. Generations of peasants had divided their fields with hedgerows, earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that grew 10, sometimes 15 feet high. The walls themselves rose 4 feet from the surrounding terrain, their bases thick with roots that had been accumulating since the Middle Ages. Between these walls ran sunken lanes, ancient paths worn down by centuries of cart traffic, until they sat 3 feet below the surrounding fields. From the air, the bocage appeared as a patchwork of small fields, each roughly the size of a football field, each bounded by impenetrable green walls. What aerial photographs could not convey was the tactical nightmare this terrain presented to armored forces. A tank advancing through bocage could see perhaps 50 yards in any direction. The hedgerows blocked line of sight completely. The sunken lanes channelized movement, forcing vehicles onto predictable paths where ambushes waited. The vegetation provided perfect concealment for infantry with anti-tank weapons. The earthen walls themselves could stop a Sherman cold if the driver attempted to climb them directly. American planners had anticipated difficult terrain. They had not anticipated this. The bocage transformed every field crossing into a potential death trap, every hedgerow gap into a kill zone, every 100 yards of advance into a grinding tactical problem with no elegant solution. German defenders understood the terrain intimately. Many had trained in similar country. They positioned anti-tank guns at hedgerow corners where they could cover multiple approach routes. They dug tanks into reverse slope positions where only their turrets showed above the earthen walls. They registered artillery on every gap and intersection. They waited. American armor, designed for the open warfare of North Africa and the plains of Europe, died in the bocage at rates that threatened the entire campaign. Shermans burned. Crews burned with them. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. German defenders could destroy advancing armor faster than replacements arrived. Into this killing ground came the 3rd Armored Division, and with it a tank commander who would become the highest-scoring American tanker of the war. His name was Lafayette G. Poole. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a farmer who had been given a steel box and told to drive it through hell. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Lafayette Poole was born in 1919 in Odom, Texas, a town so small it barely registered on state maps. His father worked oil fields. His mother kept a garden that fed the family through lean years. Poole grew up understanding machinery the way farm boys understood machines, as tools that required constant attention, intimate knowledge, and a certain rough affection. He was not a large man, 5'8", 160 pounds, with hands that seemed too delicate for the work they performed. His eyes were the color of the Texas sky before a storm, pale blue and watchful. He smiled rarely and spoke less. His crew would learn that when Poole did speak, every word carried weight. He enlisted in 1941, before Pearl Harbor made the decision for most American men. The Army sent him to armored training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where he discovered an aptitude that no civilian occupation had revealed. He understood tanks, not just how to drive them or maintain them, but how they moved through space, how they related to terrain, how a 60,000-pound machine could become either predator or prey depending on decisions made in fractions of seconds. His instructors noted his quietness, his patience, his willingness to sit in observation for hours, while other trainees grew restless. They noted something else, too. Poole possessed an unusual ability to read ground. He could look at a terrain feature and immediately understand where an enemy would position, where cover existed, where the kill zones lay. This was not taught. This was instinct refined by attention. He arrived in England in early 1944, assigned to Company Wide, 32nd Armored Regiment. His tank was a standard M4 Sherman, serial number 3089662. The crew called it "In the Mood" after the Glenn Miller tune that played constantly on Armed Forces radio. Poole never called it anything. To him, it was simply the machine that would keep his crew alive or fail to. The Sherman had a reputation by 1944, and it was not entirely favorable. American tankers called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lit on fire so reliably. The armor was thin by German standards. The 75-millimeter gun was adequate against earlier Panzer models, but struggled against the thick frontal plates of Panthers and Tigers. The high silhouette made it visible from distances where German tanks remained hidden, but the Sherman had virtues that its critics sometimes overlooked. It was mechanically reliable. It was fast. It could be manufactured in quantities that dwarfed German production, and in the hands of a crew that understood its limitations, it could kill. Poole understood those limitations better than most. He had spent his months in England studying after-action reports from North Africa and Italy. He had questioned veterans about what worked and what got men killed. He had developed theories about how to fight in a tank that was not the best tank on the battlefield. The core of his thinking was simple. If you cannot outshoot the enemy and you cannot out-armor the enemy, you must outthink the enemy. You must see him before he sees you. You must shoot first. You must be where he does not expect. The bocage would test every element of this philosophy. The problem facing American armor in Normandy was fundamental. German defensive doctrine and German equipment were both optimized for the terrain. The Panzer IV and Panther tanks carried guns that could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. German crews were experienced, many having fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet armor. German commandos understood how to use the hedgerows as force multipliers, channeling American advances into prepared kill zones. American doctrine, by contrast, had been developed for different conditions. Armored divisions were designed to exploit breakthroughs, to sweep across open terrain and disrupt enemy rear areas. The tactics assumed mobility, assumed that tanks could maneuver to find favorable engagement angles, assumed that superior American numbers would eventually overwhelm defensive positions. None of these assumptions held in the bocage. Mobility was constrained by terrain. Maneuver was impossible when hedgerows blocked every alternative route. Superior numbers meant nothing when only one or two tanks could engage at a time through a single gap. The result was attrition of the worst kind. American tanks pushed forward through hedgerow gaps. German anti-tank guns and tanks waited on the far side of the next field. The first Sherman through the gap died. Sometimes the second died too. Eventually, artillery or infantry cleared the position, and the process repeated at the next hedgerow. Casualties mounted. Replacement tanks arrived faster than replacement crews could be trained. The campaign threatened to stall within sight of the invasion beaches. Poole observed these failures with the same patient attention he had applied to everything since childhood. He watched tanks die. He noted the circumstances. He began to see patterns. The Germans always knew where American tanks were. The sound of Sherman engines carried across the bocage landscape with perfect clarity. The movement of hedgerow branches betrayed approaching armor. The dust, raised by tank treads, hung in the still summer air like signal flags. But the Americans rarely knew where German tanks were. German crews had learned to wait with engines off. They camouflaged their vehicles with local vegetation until tanks became indistinguishable from hedgerows. They positioned in shadow rather than sunlight. They let Americans come to them. Poole realized that survival in the bocage required becoming what the Germans had become: invisible, patient, the hunter rather than the hunted. He began experimenting with his own crew in the days after the initial breakout from the beaches. The experiments were simple. He found positions that offered good fields of fire and good concealment. He cut his engine. He waited. He observed how long it took for his own eyes to detect movement in the surrounding hedgerows. He timed how quickly sound traveled. He noted which angles of sunlight revealed hidden positions and which obscured them. His crew thought he was cautious to the point of timidity. They learned otherwise on the morning of June 17th. Poole had positioned his Sherman in a sunken lane, the tank's hull completely hidden below the level of the surrounding fields. Branches and mud covered the turret. The engine had been off for 40 minutes. The crew sat in silence, barely breathing, watching through vision slits caked with camouflage. A German patrol appeared first. Infantry, moving carefully along a parallel hedgerow. They passed within 30 yards of the hidden Sherman without reacting. Poole did not fire. Infantry were not worth revealing his position. 20 minutes later, the sound came. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Poole's loader whispered a question. Poole raised one finger. Wait. The first Panzer IV pushed through a gap in the hedgerow perhaps 60 yards ahead. Its commander stood in the open hatch, scanning the terrain through binoculars. He looked directly at Poole's position. His gaze passed over the mud-covered turret without pause. He saw hedgerow. He saw shadow. He did not see a tank. Poole waited until the second Panzer cleared the gap. He waited until both tanks had committed to the open field. Then he spoke one word to his gunner. The first round struck the lead Panzer in the side armor below the turret ring. The tank lurched, smoke pouring from the hatches. The second round was already loaded. Poole's gunner shifted aim with the precision of long practice. The second Panzer was still traversing its turret, still searching for a target it could not find, when the round punched through its engine deck. Poole started his engine. The Sherman surged forward from its hidden position, racing across the field toward the next hedgerow, before surviving German infantry could organize a response. Behind him, 2 Panzer IVs burned. That engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It established principles that Poole would refine over the following weeks. The principles were simple, but demanded discipline that most tank crews found difficult to maintain. First, arrive in position before the enemy knows you exist. This meant moving at night when possible or using terrain to mask approach. It meant accepting slow progress to achieve surprise. Second, become invisible. This meant cutting engines and sitting in silence for extended periods. It meant camouflage that went beyond regulation standards. Poole's crew learned to gather local vegetation at every stop, layering branches and mud until their Sherman resembled a mobile hedge rather than a war machine. It meant choosing positions where shadow and background concealed the tank's distinctive outline. Third, wait for multiple targets. A single kill might reveal your position. Multiple kills in rapid succession could break an enemy formation before effective response was possible. Poole learned to let lead elements pass, waiting for the moment when maximum damage could be inflicted in minimum time. Fourth, move immediately after firing. The muzzle flash and sound of a Sherman's 75mm gun could be located within seconds by trained observers. Survival depended on being elsewhere when return fire arrived. These principles violated much of what American armor doctrine prescribed. Doctrine emphasized aggression, movement, the exploitation of firepower superiority. Poole's methods emphasized patience, concealment, and the acceptance that one well-positioned tank could accomplish what a platoon of aggressive tanks could not. His success silenced critics. In the weeks following that first ambush, Poole and his crew accumulated kills at a rate that drew attention from division headquarters. German crews began reporting an American tank that appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished before counterattack could be organized. The reports described confusion and fear. Panzer columns would advance through seemingly clear terrain. The lead vehicle would explode without warning. Crews would scan desperately for the source of fire and see nothing. More rounds would arrive. More vehicles would die. By the time survivors located the American position, it was empty. Poole was not the only American tanker employing these methods. Others had reached similar conclusions through their own experience, but Poole's systematic approach and his willingness to share what he learned with other crews accelerated the spread of bocage tactics throughout the 3rd Armored Division. The tactics worked because they exploited a fundamental asymmetry. German crews had superior equipment but limited numbers. They could not afford losses. American crews had inferior equipment but near unlimited replacements. They could afford to take risks, but only if those risks produced results. Poole's methods inverted the usual dynamic by becoming the hunter rather than the hunted, by forcing German crews to react rather than act. He shifted the burden of uncertainty onto the enemy. A German commander advancing through bocage could never be certain that the next hedgerow did not conceal an invisible Sherman waiting in silence. The mathematics of the campaign began to shift. American advances that had stalled in the face of determined resistance began to progress. Not quickly, not without cost, but progress nonetheless. The breakout, when it came in late July, owed something to the tactical innovations that men like Poole had developed in the deadly geometry of the hedgerows. Poole himself continued to accumulate kills through June and July. His personal tally reached numbers that made him the highest-scoring American tank ace of the war, 12 confirmed kills, possibly more. The chaos of armored combat made precise accounting difficult. On August 19th, his luck ended. A German round struck his Sherman during an engagement near Fontainebleau. The tank burned. Poole escaped with severe leg wounds that would end his combat career and leave him walking with a limp for the rest of his life. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit. He returned to Texas after the war, married, raised a family, worked in jobs that had nothing to do with tanks or combat. He rarely spoke about the bocage, about the ambushes, about the men he had killed or the men he had lost. But the principles he had developed survived him. Military historians studying the Normandy campaign documented the evolution of American armor tactics during the bocage fighting. They traced the spread of concealment techniques, the shift from aggressive advance to patient ambush, the recognition that visibility was as important as firepower in determining who lived and who died. Modern tankers still study these lessons. The fundamentals have not changed despite decades of technological evolution. A tank that can be seen can be killed. A tank that cannot be seen controls the engagement. Patience and positioning still matter more than raw firepower. The hedgerows are quieter now. Tourists pass through villages where American and German armor once fought and died within sight of church steeples. Occasionally, a farmer's plow still unearths a shell casing or a piece of track. The ground remembers what the living have chosen to forget. In those summer weeks of 1944, the bocage consumed men and machines with industrial efficiency. The Americans who survived did so by learning to become something their training had not prepared them to become. They learned to wait. They learned to hide. They learned that the answer to superior enemy firepower was not more firepower of their own, but the discipline to remain invisible until the moment of maximum advantage. He died in 1991, age 71, in his hometown in Texas. His obituary mentioned his medals, his family, his service. It did not mention the German commanders who died still searching the hedgerows, still asking their radio men the same desperate question. "Where is he? I can't see him. I can't see anything." The silence of the bocage was the only answer they received.